Hello and welcome to the Election Show. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. Joining me today, as always, via Zoom is Matt McDermott, Communication Strategist and Vice President of Whitman Insight Strategies, and also with us today is political analyst and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. I've missed you so.
Great to be with you guys again.
There's an old jazz standard, what a difference a day makes, or what a difference a week makes. So last time we were together, we had Donald Trump, who had been impeached one time. We're now back together. He has the infamous title now as the only U.S. president to be impeached twice. 10 Republicans who joined Democrats in charging Trump. That's the most sort of crossover we've ever seen. He obviously is not happy about this. The articles of impeachment were presented. They passed in the House. We know that for prosecution or removal, that goes through the Senate. Mitch McConnell is saying we don't really have time. We're essentially 6 days away from Joe Biden becoming the 46th president of the United States. Nancy Pelosi wore the same dress that she had on the first time they impeached Donald Trump. And here we are just, a year and a half later, and he's being impeached again. Matt, was it important for the Democrats, House Democrats, and even the 10 Republicans who joined them, was that important for the articles of impeachment to be served and for Donald Trump to be impeached a second time, less than 2 weeks before he leaves office?
Of course it was important. I've been struck this week by some of the punditry that's out there, largely on the Republican side, that essentially suggests that, yes, what Donald Trump did is horrific. Yes, what Donald Trump did is in fact impeachable, but the timing is just not appropriate because Joe Biden's inauguration is a week away. That is no excuse for accountability or avoiding accountability in this case. So of course, impeachment was important in part because our history books are being written as we speak. This administration will go down in history as the most corrupt, the most lawless, the most negatively impactful on the American people, a total lack of leadership from anyone in this administration. And it's increasingly obvious that once Donald Trump is removed from office, there probably will be criminal accountability for many of the actions that they have undertaken while he's been in this White House. So I think impeachment is important regardless of how the Senate proceeds on conviction, because it says to the American people and it says to Republicans that what has happened is not okay. And we cannot continue to accept this type of lawlessness from a major political party in this country. And you've seen in polling over the past few days, in response to the insurrection last week and now in response to the impeachment that followed, that the American people are there with the Democratic Party and the select Republicans that have spoken out. An overwhelming amount of Americans support impeachment. An overwhelming number of Americans want Donald Trump removed. An overwhelming number of Americans want him stripped of his post-presidential powers. And you see in polling just out today, his approval rating is down below 30%, is 29% in the Pew poll released today, with a collapse in particular among Republican voters. This is not acceptable behavior. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that a majority of Americans support the actions of the past week in any respect. They want this man out and they want him held accountable.
So Matt, you bring up an interesting point because it's not just what he's capable of doing for the next 5 or 6 days. This post-presidency option is pretty interesting because we know that Donald Trump has said, 2024, I might come back. So it seems to have put Mitch McConnell in a touch of a bind because if Donald Trump goes around the country for the next 4 years threatening to run again, that does handicap many of the Republicans who are on the bench hoping to move to that next federal level and run for the presidency. Lincoln, I want to bring you in because when we think about impeachment, even though we had 10 Republicans side with Democrats and vote to impeach the president, the vast majority of Republicans not only voted against the articles of impeachment, they're still doubling down and saying that Joe Biden wasn't elected in a free and fair election, and they're still on the stop the steal train. So what does it say about the hyperpartisanship that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are walking into? when we still don't see the vast majority of Republicans supporting impeachment after the events of January 6th, after we know that Donald Trump preferred to watch television and see his supporters rip down the halls of Congress as opposed to doing anything about it. He still hasn't made a real substantive statement, really disavowing these supporters. He's made statements, but those are those hostage videos where he's essentially winking and smiling at his supporters, saying, they're making me do this, but I don't really believe it. So where do we go with hyperpartisan politics since Republicans haven't supported it? And also, what's the role of Mitch McConnell in trying to figure out Donald Trump in these next few steps, where he possibly is eligible to run for the presidency again? Whether he will or he won't means nothing, but he can still threaten it for the next 4 years.
197 House Republicans voted against impeachment. That's not a surprise, but that number should be noted when we think of the 10 who did. Yesterday, it was reported that Lisa Murkowski, who is not a kind of down the line with Trump woman who was a senator from Alaska, Republican senator, said she was open to the idea of convicting. If the best that we have so far is that Lisa Murkowski is open to the idea of convicting, then we need to not bury the lead here. And the lead is that the Republican Party is still the Trump cult. That hasn't changed. The events on January 6th and since January 6th, where we've learned that the events of January 6th were worse than we thought, hasn't changed. So that is the Republican Party. That means that President Biden, Vice President Harris will begin their presidency with a party that believes they are illegitimate, and a third of the American people who support that view. That is the context in which their presidency will occur, and that is the context that all but guarantees greater instability, further instability going forward. Now, with regards to McConnell is, to me, playing a fascinating game here. He is trying to sound like the reasonable person, right? He gave that speech on the 6th. He didn't support after the demonstration, after the riots, the breaking of the siege of the Capitol, that it was, he changed his position a little bit. But we should remember, Mitch McConnell woke up on the morning of January 6th pretty much without saying much about any problems of the Trump administration. So if you woke up on the morning on January 6th, I don't care if you change your mind that day, you're part of the problem. But McConnell is doing this because he is focusing on a couple of things. McConnell is good at thinking a few moves down the chessboard. And the major thing here is that although with that sweep of the runoffs in Georgia, the Democrats got to 50, with Kamala Harris, that's 51 because she's the tiebreaker. When there is a deadlock in the Senate of this kind, there is usually some kind of power sharing arrangement. And McConnell is trying to rapidly clean himself up. So he's not aligned with the Hawleys and the Cruzes so that he can get the most he can for the Republicans in that power sharing arrangement. And the reason for that is that his leadership within the Republican caucus in the US Senate is not as secure as everybody seems to believe. All he needed to do to hold on to a majority was to go 1 for 2 in Georgia, a state that as of 2 weeks ago, many thought was still a pretty red state, and he couldn't do that. Now, the Republican Senate delegation is a little bit split, and McConnell is not a young man, so they may decide that it's just easier to stick with him for another 2, 4, perhaps 6, I doubt 6 years. But that's what he's thinking, and that's the balance he's trying to strike. And we saw that when last week, or earlier this week, he said for the media, he said, well, I am open to the idea of impeachment, which is his way of signaling I'm not a Trump cult lunatic, to use a technical term. On the other hand, he then said, but we can't reconvene the Senate until the 19th of January, which was his way of saying to the base, to the cult, we're not actually going to do anything here. That's where McConnell is right now.
So, I mean, it's fascinating because Mitch McConnell is trying to eke out a win somehow out of the disaster that Donald Trump is leaving them with. And we know that Donald Trump cares not about not just America, but definitely the Republican Party. And so it's interesting to see the Republicans try and scramble in a soon-to-be post-Trump era, but still try and sort of make a way for themselves. I mean, Matt, you've mentioned this over the past few months that we've been speaking. I tell my students this all the time. Whenever we have a question, follow the money. And so with Donald Trump leaving, running around the country, threatening to run again, is it really all about just him raising money, either personally? I mean, we know the grift knows no bounds. And so even when he was raising money for Stop the Steal, the fine print essentially said, but this is kind of my money. I can use it for whatever, whether it's lawsuits. We know that he's now split with Giuliani or yet again, and they may or may not come back together. But how much of Donald Trump threatening to run again in 2024 is about sort of keeping the Trump cult, Trump base together, or how much from your, consultant's perspective, is it really about, I just got to keep grifting because I've got Deutsche Bank, coming down the pike. I've got lots of debt that, we know he structured some of his debt in peculiar ways where now he might be personally culpable for the first time ever. What's the next step for Donald Trump with this outdoor grift?
It's all a grift. It's a grift for Donald Trump. It's a grift for his family. It's a grift for members of his administration. It's a grift for the Ted Cruzes and Josh Hawleys of the world who have now hitched their horse to this Trump train. It's a grift for all of them, in part because there is no financial future for Donald Trump post-presidency. He's lost his contracts in New York. He'll start losing his hotel and golf course contracts across America, given what happened last week. There is no financial incentive for Donald Trump to hop off this train. It's making him money. It's making his family money. And it's paying for the lifestyle that they live. It's always been a grift. It's why they've sold, their books through the RNC and the Trump campaign. It's all a way for them to make money off people who don't know better. A concern that many of us have had of the incoming Biden team and Joe Biden himself is his openness to bipartisanship with the Republican Party. And I think a lot of us have sort of put up a caution flag and said, bipartisanship and conversation is great, but the reality is this Republican Party has no interest in negotiating with Democrats whatsoever. And we've seen that for decades now. I think what this week has done is shown to Democrats across the political aisle, from the Joe Manchins of the world to the AOCs of the world, that there is no negotiating with this Republican Party. And if we want to do anything in the time we have available to us now, with a majority across the executive and legislative branch, we need to do that. And we need to use the 50+1 we have in the Senate and our narrow House majority to get stuff done for the American people. Because if we don't, there is a good chance we lose that majority, and there's a good chance we don't get it back for a decade to come. And so I think, as horrific as the last week has been, it has shown Democrats in elected office at the federal level that they have a mandate to use that governing majority to get stuff done. And it doesn't need to be in partnership with the Republican Party.
I don't think that Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer fully understand the Republicans that they're dealing with. I think they've known them for decades. And so they think that these are men who haven't been completely tainted by this Trump cult and the power that they've had. And realistically, we've got 2 years to get it right. And if not, Democrats risk not having anything at all. So,
and I think that concern is exactly valid, and which is why I think the party, the grassroots of the party, needs to keep up the pressure on our elected leaders, because this is really our chance to do something. And if we don't, we lose that power, and Republicans control government 2 years from now.
2022 is a fascinating year. The Senate map, the only two, I think, remotely vulnerable Democrats are going to be Mark Kelly and Raphael Warnock, because they won the specials and they have to get it back on cycle. Republican-held seats in Ohio, Florida, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina are up. So this could be an unusual with regards to the Senate off year. The House is different. The losing control of the House would be absolutely disastrous. They would impeach Joe Biden on January 10th of 2023 if that happens. But the Republicans, what happened last week will cost them 2 or 3 points in the polls for a while. And to marry that to being the party of obstruction is not a recipe for winning. It's the only card Kevin McCarthy has to play, but it's not a great one.
Just to shift gears just a little bit, Lincoln, I want to stick with you. By the time we meet again next week, we will have gone through an inauguration. Donald Trump has already stated that he would not attend inauguration. Now, the three of us have been speaking for quite some time. We knew that he didn't have the class or the dignity or the courage to attend an inauguration. What has been sort of such a hallmark of American democracy and in this democratic republic is even when Bill Clinton beat the incumbent George H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush attended the inauguration. We saw unity, not just between parties, but sort of the passing of the Democratic torch, which was very important for Americans to see, but also the world to see. When Hillary Clinton was defeated by Donald Trump as the wife of a former president and former Secretary of State and former senator, she attended the inauguration. She sat on the dais. and again, representative in the visuals for Americans and the world to see another peaceful transition of power. Lincoln, Donald Trump has said he's not going. Now, we know that we're going to have a scaled down version of an inauguration because of the events of January 6th, because the FBI has said that there are credible threats of white nationalists planning insurrections across all 50 states, but especially the days of January 17th to January 21st. How significant is it that Donald Trump has announced that he's not going, he's not interested in going? No one in his family thus far is set to go, guaranteed to go. What does that mean for Americans? What does that mean for his base? And what does that mean for the international community, who I know you speak to quite a bit, that he's just choosing to break with precedent?
It is not significant at all. Because if Donald Trump were to go, would we now say, oh, it's a peaceful transition? Oh, he understands democracy. Oh, he's a small d Democrat. We'd say, no, he's a hypocrite. Donald Trump doesn't believe in democracy. Donald Trump doesn't believe in the peaceful transition. And in his heart, he believes that if he loses an election, it is axiomatically a fraudulent election. So frankly, if I were Joe Biden, I guess you'd have to invite him, but I wouldn't want him there. Now, the other part of this, that's kind of the visceral part. The other part of this is that the United States, we as a people, you, me, Matt, the people watching, our broader American community, all of us, we holding on to this idea that we are, to use Ronald Reagan's words, the shining city on the hill, this beacon of democracy for the rest of the world. I travel all over the world. I remember living in China in the 1980s and people asked me about racism and homelessness in the United States. It's not like the rest of the world doesn't know this. Have you ever sat down with a foreign colleague and then pushing you to explain the Electoral College, and then when they finally figured out, laughing because it's just so absurd on the topic, on the surface? We've all had that experience. We need to recognize that we are not some perfect democracy. We are not.
I never have been.
No.
We can be a model for the world, for some of the world, and at times we are, but for the most part, we're a deeply flawed democracy, like many countries. And the way we can address these flaws is not by ignoring them and dressing it up by having Donald Trump attend an inauguration. This man who is the face of American fascism in the 21st century should not be allowed in the city of Washington anymore, let alone at Joe Biden's inauguration. A better approach would be to recognize that we're imperfect and to look to our friends and allies and supporters in other Democrats and democratic countries around the rest of the world and see what they do and how we can learn from them, rather than clinging, and I use that word, I'm kind of channeling Barack Obama here, clinging to this notion that we are somehow special and have nothing to learn from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world should always learn for us. That is a jingoistic, bizarre approach to understanding the world in the year 2021.
I mean, listen, as a Black American who travels internationally extensively and trying to explain American politics as a Black person, and not just the 400-year history, but the 40-year history, right? I mean, lots of people, they have televisions, they have the internet, and they're very well aware of what is going on and what has gone on in this nation. Matt, do you agree with Lincoln's assessment about Donald Trump not attending the inauguration, where it's like, there's really no news here, he shouldn't be there, we don't need him there, and what would the purpose serve?
Entirely, because I think what this insurrection did is bring into the light the reality of the Trump administration. For far too many years, you and I and Lincoln and others have been talking about the severity of this situation, the very threat it presented to our democracy, and just how frail those institutional protections are in ensuring that, travesty doesn't happen, Trump upends an election, and democracy is forever ruined. The frailty of that is now out in the open. And you have to be a dope not to see what's happening and just how close to ruin we got in the past week. And that's important because I think far too long, look, Republicans have been trying to chip away at those democratic institutions for decades. And I think Democrats have stepped back and said, well, this is a problem, and have rhetorically spoken out about it, but haven't actually had the will or the power or frankly, the numbers in the legislature to do anything about it. And now we do. There is no doubt whatsoever about what's happening here, what the Republican Party has been trying to do, how Trump was able to elevate himself because of what the Republican Party has done over these past decades. And Democrats need to actually enact reforms to ensure this never happens again. I hate to say that there's a silver lining in this situation, but I really do hope. I've talked to a number of people on the Hill over the past week, a number of people in Congress who have long been institutionalist, sort of the Steny Hoyers of the world, who are just outraged about what has happened here and have shown, at least in rhetoric, a real willingness to do something about it now in a way that they frankly just have not in past years. And so I think that is important. I think the party needs to hold them accountable for those promises that they're making. But I do think there's really been a seismic shift within the Democratic Party in the past week towards action and towards stomping out, fascism in America right now.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, I can't wait to keep talking about this because I still don't think the Democrats get it. I still don't think that they understand the capacity of their colleagues who, just on the evening of January 6th, were still saying that this is a false election. I mean, there is a connection between the insurrection and this sort of stop the steal. And I just don't think that they get the larger small d Democratic project.
I don't think Joe Biden gets it. And that's concerning. I want to point out there's this narrative in Washington now and in the mainstream of the political discourse, Joe Biden gets the Senate. But Joe Biden has a lot of knowledge about the Senate that may actually be dangerous here. He has not served in the Senate since 2008. He served in a very different institution with a very different group of people. So what he thinks he knows may not be applicable here. I very much agree with you, Christina, that the time it took for the Democratic leadership to understand just how grave the threat of Trump was, because nothing other than the specifics, there's nothing that they said in that impeachment discussion on Wednesday that we didn't know on January 21st of 2017. And they just wanted to not believe it. And that doesn't just go to Democratic elected officials. That's the kind of center-left punditry. For years, we were told, don't do impeachment because in a democracy, we solve things through elections. But of course, what makes us think this is democracy anymore? The Democratic leadership walked away from really getting to the truth about Russia because they just kind of gave in to the Republican disinformation campaign.
Right. And we already saw Republicans saying impeachment would be divisive. It would upset, a certain portion of the electorate. Don't do it. But Matt, I want to bring you in here before we only have 5 minutes left because you are one of my favorite people to follow on social media just because you get to the point. And you have very little patience for nonsensical Democrats and definitely no patience for Republicans. How significant is it that Donald Trump has been stripped of his social media platform? And what does that mean moving forward? So pretty soon, we are going to have Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States. People won't wake up in a panic every morning, frantically checking Twitter to see what rant the president is on, in the morning and who he's fighting with domestically or internationally. But it seems as though the tech community is finally waking up and saying, this man poses a grave danger to American society by being able to spout off lies. And, they had the little disclaimers, but that wasn't enough. As someone who I would argue utilizes social media incredibly well to process information for others, but also disseminate information, what's the significance of Donald Trump essentially being persona non grata on, everything but, like Match.com? I mean, everyone has said, you're off our platform.
It's important, but it's not enough. And let's be clear about why they're doing it. They're doing it because Democrats now have control of Congress and have every intent on regulating these very entities. And they're trying to preempt what is going to be a pretty aggressive accountability mechanism that's put in place by Congress on the Facebooks of the world. So let's just be clear about why they're doing it. But I think the sentiment is right, and it needs to go further. Every racist, white supremacist, affiliated organization or person in this country needs to be deplatformed. I cannot underscore it enough. The idea that Meet the Press or CNN or MSNBC or Twitter or Facebook or YouTube should be platforming demagoguery is nonsense. And I'm so tired of the argument that's been made by many journalists who should know better that we need to hear both sides of the debate. And we heard yesterday on Twitter, essentially from Politico, the equation of Ben Shapiro to someone like a Chris Hayes. That is absurd on its face. One is rooted in fact. Whether it's a progressive or liberal look at those facts is one thing, but it's rooted in fact. Another is based in falsehoods and lies that are rooted in racism. Those people need to be deplatformed. It's not just Donald Trump. And the longer social media companies take to do that, the more harm it does to our democracy, and the more harm it does to the conversation that we're having in this country that needs to be rooted in fact, not fiction.
Right. And I mean, the fact that we still keep treating Mark Zuckerberg like he's some 18-year-old boy is part and parcel of the problem.
100%.
So Lincoln, we've got about 30 seconds here. What are you going to be looking at or looking for during the inauguration?
Well, the main thing is I'm really hoping there's no violence. I'm really hoping it occurs peacefully, not just in Washington, but throughout the country in the coming days. I'm very concerned that we are heading into more violence, not less violence. The second thing is Joe Biden's tone. He has to, on the one hand, recognize that we are putting a very, very dark period in American history. Hopefully we are moving. It's not a given, but hopefully we're putting that behind us. But he also, and maybe the inaugural isn't the time, but very shortly after taking office, he has to lay out an agenda. He began yesterday with that $1.9 trillion COVID program, which will be his signature legislation, and which any Democrat who doesn't support that, as far as I'm concerned, that they are really betraying their party, their president, and their country ultimately.
Well, I mean, in the upcoming weeks, hopefully we'll have time to talk about not just Joe Biden's agenda and his tone, but also excavating what happened on January 6th, who knew what and when, because it is very important that the Senate and the members of the House root out anyone who aided and abetted those insurrectionists. And I think Joe Biden also needs to set a very firm tone to make sure that everyone is fundamentally on the same page, that we cannot have sitting members of Congress who have any inkling of sort of belief that what happened on January 6th was okay. When we think about the swastikas that we saw in the Capitol, the Confederate flag, the feces, the graffiti, the fact that they were beating police officers with American flagpoles. So we hopefully will have a peaceful January 20th and the days leading up to it, and also the days after. But I do think, gentlemen, that we are in a very precarious position in our democracy. So I love spending time with you all, but that's all the time we have today. Thank you all both so much for being here with me. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. Take care, and thanks for watching The Election Show.